Good morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. Glad we have this time to be together and study from the Word of God. We're studying the parables of Jesus that are found in the Gospel of Luke. That's our study in this Sunday morning class. And we have a tough one this morning. We have the parable of the unjust steward. And there's some real challenges to this parable, and I think properly applying it. One of the things that we'll be talking about as we go through this parable is you have to be careful about overanalyzing, trying to make too much application of specific things. And so we'll kind of talk about that, because if you tried to make every point of this parable mean something, you'd probably come up with some crazy conclusions. And so let's go to Luke chapter 16. If you have your study guide, we're on lesson 9. If you don't, we're just going to be talking about this parable that's in the first verses of Luke chapter 16. Luke 16, beginning verse 1. Let's read it. He said unto his disciples, there was a certain rich man which had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And he called him and said unto him, How is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward. Then the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig, to beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, How much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, Take thy bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, And how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said unto him, Take thy bill, and write 80. And the Lord commended the unjust steward, because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if ye have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And the Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they derided him. Okay, so this parable is a little bit different. A lot of commentators think it falls pretty closely in right after the ones we studied the last couple of weeks in chapter 15. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, prodigal son. And this one seems like it was pretty close in conjunction to the other. A big difference here is that those parables in chapter 15 were directed toward the criticisms that the Pharisees were making. This man associates with publicans and sinners. And so he told those three parables in chapter 15, that are recorded in chapter 15 in reaction to what the Pharisees were saying. This man associates with sinners and publicans. But notice as chapter 16 begins, it begins with an and, which would make you think that this is probably in pretty close conjunction with the previous parables. But he said this to his disciples. Notice he's not responding to the Pharisees here. Now the Pharisees are going to react, so the Pharisees are still within earshot. The Pharisees are still hearing what he says, because if you notice down there at verse 14, the Pharisees also who were covetous heard all these things, and they derided him. So the Pharisees are still hearing this, but this parable specifically is directed toward his parable, unto his disciples, he said. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as we go along. The parable is about a steward. Anybody want to help us with what a steward is? What is a steward? What does a steward do? Okay, so a steward, he doesn't own it himself, but he's overseeing it. But it belongs to somebody else, and he's responsible for it. And I think that's exactly right. It's the oversight of that which belongs to another. Here's an interesting, maybe to really illustrate that, go to Titus chapter 1. When we mention that chapter, you probably should think pretty quickly. Titus 1 is one of the two listings of the qualifications of elders. Notice as the qualification of elders is listed beginning verse 7, this is not the start of it, but in this, Titus 1:7, a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, and so on. So an elder is called a steward. So what's an elder? Well, that word, steward, suggests oversight. Actually, it's from the word episkopos, the Greek word episkopos, which we often translate as bishop, but it's overseer. So clearly an elder, he's overseeing something, but it's not his own for sure. The church doesn't belong to the elder. He's overseeing the Lord's flock, right? It belongs to the Lord, but the elder is an overseer. And so you get the idea, that's the idea of stewardship. It doesn't belong to him, but he's responsible. It doesn't belong to him, but he has accountability as to how it's being taken care of. Well, the problem was, right there at the end of verse 1, the same was accused unto the master that he had wasted his goods. And the master called him and said to him, how is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward. I think so he's accused of misusing or wasting that which he was in charge of overseeing, right? So he's accused. Do you see anything that's lacking here? Maybe I'm fishing for something. Carol?
Who are these witnesses that said that he was wasting?
Well, yeah, no witnesses are called. I think that's true. But what I was fishing for there, Carol, he didn't deny it. There was no denial. He could have said, oh, bring forth some witnesses. I don't see any witnesses testifying against me. He didn't deny it. So apparently, it was pretty well established. He couldn't argue the case that he had been misusing his master's goods. Verse 1 in the King James says he had wasted his master's good. And apparently it was pretty widely reported because it got back to the master. How is this that I hear this of thee? And you're not going to be my steward anymore. Give an account of yourself and you're not going to be the steward anymore. The way the King James says it there at the end of verse 2 sort of leaves it in question. You might not be my steward anymore, but I think it's intended to be more definite. You are not to be my steward anymore is the idea. So, the steward comes up with a solution to the problem. His solution is he's going to try to get the debtors. So in other words, people owe his master money. And he's sort of been in charge of that, and he hadn't been doing a good job in regulating expenses and receivables, In other words, the master obviously spends some money, but the master also has money coming in. And the steward has been in charge of that. And so he says, I got a problem here. Verse 3, I've always thought this was kind of impressive. What am I going to do? For the Lord taketh away my stewardship. In other words, he understood this is definite. I'm not steward anymore. The Lord is taking away my stewardship. What about this guy? I cannot dig. To beg, I am ashamed. In other words, I'm not even able to go out and earn an honest day's wage. I can't dig. I can't do physical labor. And I'm really, you get the idea this guy's probably been living pretty high, right? Because he's had control of apparently a fairly wealthy man's goods. And so he's probably been living pretty high. And he says, I'm just ashamed to go out and beg. So here's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to be put out of the stewardship, and when I am, I'm going to do something so that these other people will take care of me. Okay, I'm not going to be. I can't do physical labor. I'm too ashamed to beg. I'm going to endear myself to these other people, so that when I am put out, and I'm going to be put out, there's no question about this. I'm going to endear myself to them so that when I am put out, they'll receive me into their, in other words, they'll take care of me. They'll feel indebted to me. So what he does there is he tells the various debtors, two are mentioned. Remember, this is a story. This is a word picture that Jesus is painting. Somebody said, well, you think he only had two debtors? I don't know. It doesn't really matter, right? We know what he did in response to these two. And this is just a story. This is a parable. This is not a real life event. Jesus is illustrating a principle by telling a story. And in this story, he mentions two debtors. One owed 100 measures of oil. Take thy bill quickly. Sit down and write 50. Cut it in half. You owe my master 100. If you'll just pay 50, we'll call the account square. We'll be all even. Now, who wouldn't do that? If you owed somebody $100 and they said, give me 50, we'll call it even. You'd jump at a chance to do that, right? Who wouldn't? So he says, take your bill. You owe 100 measures of oil, write 50. And then another man owed 100 measures of wheat. Take thy bill and write 80. Knock it down to 80. Again, that would be, if you owed 100 and somebody say, just pay me 80, we'll call it even. You'd take that deal too, right? So he's making sort of outrageous deals to his master's debtors. They'd be glad to have a thing like that. So that's what they did. What's the problem with what he's done here? Anybody want to characterize that? What's the problem with what he's done? He's making friends. In other words, to those debtors, they like what he's doing. But what's the real underlying problem here? John?
Well, I mean, he's not doing right by the master.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, he actually gets commended for acting shrewdly.
Yeah.
It says shrewdly.
Yeah. So the problem here is that this is dishonest, right? This is corruption. If you heard about that, let's say that, thankfully, we're kind of in a mode in Washington, D.C., where some different government agencies are being investigated. They're being investigated for corruption, right? Isn't that the word we are hearing a lot of? There's a lot of corruption here. Wouldn't it, so if in the investigations that are ongoing about these various government agencies, they found out that somebody owed $100 million. And one of these government employees said, just pay $50 million and we'll call it even. Well, that would make headlines. That's graft. That's corruption. That's pure dishonesty, right? So what this guy did as a steward was dishonest. And really, usually behind corruption is self-gratification. In other words, so if I'm the government agent who's telling this other entity, you owe $100 million, just pay 50 and we'll call it even. If I'm the government agent who's making that deal, I'm not doing that for that guy's benefit. And while you're at it, give me $5 million under the table, right? In other words, graft and corruption is self-serving, right? And that's what's going on with this guy. He's doing this for his own benefit. He's not doing it just to be nice. He's doing it because he wants to be received into their houses. He wants these people to take care of him when he's kicked out of his stewardship. So it's dishonest. It's serving himself, certainly not serving his master's interest. This is corruption. Tom?
Another thing too is, he looks like he's not going to be manager anymore. He knows his, master's going to investigate. So when the master investigates, and he goes to the creditor, well, how much do you owe me? Oh, I owe you 50, because the guy told him, cut it in half. So master might not have any recourse to go, after.
The master might not even have any log or master copy.
Right.
He just has to go on what's being told him.
What's being told him. So, there's sort of corruption on both ends. One, the stewards, cutting things here, and in doing so, the creditor, or the one that, that has the expense, is coming I only owe you 50, I don't
Yeah.
owe you money.
Yeah. Usually corruption takes two parties to accomplish. And again, this is a story, and so, it doesn't focus on the creditors, whether they were doing right or not. It certainly focuses on this steward. So he is commended. So it says there in verse 8, the Lord commended the unjust steward. So that's something, isn't it? He was owed 100 and got 50. He was owed 100 and he got 80. And he commends the steward. Well, I think I'd be wanting to arrest that steward. I think I'd be wanting to see him put in jail. The question in our study guide, did he commend him for his honesty? No, obviously he didn't. What it goes on to say, the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. Now, I think the King James translation there is probably not too helpful when it uses the word wisely. The English Standard Version uses the word shrewdness. The New American Standard says he did shrewdly. Wycliffe's translation said he did prudently. All right, so he was shrewd in coming up with this scheme, and the master commended him for his shrewdness. He did not commend him for his honesty. He wasn't honest. Couldn't be commended for his honesty. All right, so as I said at the start, I think this is a tough parable because we're tempted to, well, wait a minute, Jesus telling us, if you get in a pinch, lie about it. If you get in a tight spot, cheat, steal, embezzle. That's not the point of the parable at all. And that's why I was saying earlier, you've got to be really careful about overanalyzing this. The purpose of the parable, the principle of the parable, is in the last half of verse 8. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And if you haven't done that already in your text, you might underline that because that's the meaning of this parable. So what Jesus is saying is the people of this world have a set of priorities. They have an agenda. They have what's important to them. They have what they want. And they go after it wholeheartedly. They don't hold back. They'll do anything to accomplish what they want, what is important to them. They don't go at it just lackadaisically. They go at it full blast. So that's what the people of this world do. What do the people of God do? He calls them here the children of light, which we could say God's people. What do God's people do? I'll just kind of go about it. I'll do what I have to do. I'm not going to go overboard. I don't want to get too crazy here. I don't want people to think I'm some kind of religious fanatic, because that's what they'll do. If I really get fully involved in serving God like I think I should, I'm afraid my friends, my family, my business associates, they're going to think I'm some kind of a religious kook. And I don't want that, so I'm not going to dive in too deeply here. I want to go to church on Sunday, but I don't, that's just something I do for a couple hours on Sunday. The rest of the week, I'm going to go about living like I want. That's what the children of light do too often. So the point Jesus is making here is the children of this world, in pursuing their priorities, are a lot more shrewd. They're a lot more dedicated. They work way harder at pursuing their priorities than God's people do in pursuing their priorities. That's the parable. That's the meaning of the parable. And anything about this parable that diminishes that overriding truth is probably overanalysis. We could talk about, this steward. We could talk about the debtors and all that. They're just there to illustrate the point. Tom?
First line, the first reader sort of, gives you the wrong idea, I think. But he says, I say to you, this is a New American Standard, he says, I say to you, make friends for yourself, he says, and I say to you, make friends for yourself by means of wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails,
Well, I want to hold on to your. I want you to make that observation just a second. Hang on to that just for a minute. Before we go to verse 9, the principle of verse 8, I think that is the lesson, principal lesson. Now, Tom is introducing us to the follow-up of that, which is verse 9. Let me read it one more time from the King James. I say to you, make to yourselves, he's talking to his disciples, right? Make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitation. Okay, Tom, go ahead and make that point now.
So the concept is, he said, it's sort of like, go ahead and do this, and it's sort of like, see if you get friends in the world. Those friends don't have eternal dwellings. So he's making a contrast to do it. He said, it's sort of like, yeah, go ahead and do this, but the consequences, the reward you're looking to get is not there. They can't provide those eternal dwellings because they don't have it.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Your observation is true, but I don't think that's what he's saying. I don't think he's saying, try it out for yourself. I don't think he's saying that. But your point is true. The mammon of unrighteousness will not bear eternal reward. That is true for sure. But let's look at it this way. First of all, what is mammon? That's a word that we don't. What is mammon? Anybody? It's just wealth, right? It's just money. Sometimes it's translated as money. If you go down to verse 13, you recognize this is the same quote as is in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 16. Verse 13, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, else he will hold the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And some translations will simply say money or wealth there. You cannot serve God and money. You can't have as your first priority money. You can't serve God, but your first priority is money. You can't do it. So that's any money, right? Now, up here in verse 9, it speaks of the mammon of unrighteousness. And you would be tempted to think that he's talking about money gained in wicked or evil or unlawful ways. And I'm not even sure that's what he's just contrasting things of the world versus eternal things. Okay. Mammon is sometimes sinfully acquired, but not necessarily so. Mammon just means money or wealth. But Jesus says, use money or wealth, in verse 9 now, use money or wealth to make friends. Make friends of money or wealth. I think here's the key. If this was illegally gained goods, what would Jesus be telling people to do? He'd be telling them to repent, give it back. If you've made this money illegally, unrighteously, you better be giving it back. You better get right. So that's why I think here that the mammon of unrighteousness in verse 9 is just money. You could almost strike through the phrase of unrighteousness. He's just referring to worldly goods. So, make friends of wealth, that when ye fail, how are you going to fail? You're going to die, right? That has to be equivalent with dying. So that when you die, you may be received into everlasting habitations. I think verse 9, and I think it's oddly worded, especially in the King James Version. I think what he's saying is use your wealth, use whatever money you have to do good, and having done so, you will receive an eternal reward when this life is over. Now, if that's the right meaning, what would be some of the ways that we could use our wealth, our material prosperity? What would be some of the ways that we could use that would lead to an eternal habitation, an eternal reward? Anybody? What would be? So you got some money. We are all, by the way, quite wealthy in the relative terms of the world. So what can you do with your wealth so that you will be received into everlasting habitation? In other words, you'll receive an eternal reward by virtue of the fact you used your money this way. Well, I think the one thing that comes quickly to mind is being benevolent, right? There's a lot of instructions in the Word of God about being benevolent people. And so when we help those who are legitimately in need, and I think there's a lot of teaching in the Bible about that. I don't think we do a great job about that, by the way. But when we are able to help people who have legitimate needs, then we're using our mammon, our wealth or money, in a way that pleases God and would lead to everlasting habitation. Can you think of any other ways that we might do it?
Greg, I always think of things backwards. I also see the warning in there to not use your money for things that you shouldn't use it.
Okay.
I don't know why I think of it like that.
So don't be using it to fund a criminal enterprise. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that would be true too. That would certainly be true. But I think this is more on the positive side, Paul. I think that use your money. He's not saying don't misuse your money so that they'll receive you. That would be a true statement. Don't misuse your money if you want to go to heaven. That would be a true statement. But I think this verse is on the positive side of that equation. Use your money in such ways that will lend toward your eternal reward. So I was thinking about benevolence. I thought the three things we very often refer to. Use your money for benevolent purposes. Use your money for evangelistic purposes. You know, we've known people who have made trips abroad to preach the gospel and funded it with their own money, right? Or maybe we know lots of people who send money to support preachers. And not talking about congregationally here. We do that, of course. But I know a number of people who send money personally to evangelists abroad. And then the other thing, of course, is for edification purposes. You know, maybe you spend your money in order to organize and conduct a group Bible study. You know, so what that means is you invite people into your home, and probably, because that's typical, I'm gonna give them snacks after they've studied at my house. I'm going to give them some snacks. So I'm spending some money, right? Not much, but I'm spending some money. So you get the point. I think verse 9 is saying, and again, I think in the King James at least, the expression that kind of throws us off is mammon of unrighteousness. Just regard that as money. I don't think he's trying to say money gained illegally, because if it was money gained illegally, he wouldn't be saying use it. He'd be saying give it back and repent. So I think so. Don't let that phrase throw you off. Use your money so that when you fail or die, you will be received into everlasting habitations. You got money. Use it as a good steward, as a servant of God. Use it in such a way as it leads to an eternal reward. Tom?
I can see that, but just the one thing is some of the pronouns that are used in there. In that last phrase, it says, like in the American, they, and that they is back up to, the friends of the righteous,
Righteousness can't receive me into eternal heaven.
That's what I'm saying. That's our initial. Because I would look at that and say, that they will receive you. Well, who's that they? And if it's these friends of unrighteousness, or that type, making friends, those friends, if it's that they, then it has a different meaning than the other way.
I just can't see it, Tom. I think he's teaching a positive lesson.
I think it's a positive lesson.
Yeah.
It has just that context to it a little bit.
In other words, it is true. What you're saying is true. If you use your money in unrighteous ways, you will not be received in eternal habitation. That's true. That's certainly a true statement. So the author asked the question, do the principles laid forth here, do they apply only to rich people? Well, I think not at all. Of course, it doesn't excuse us, because I think in relative terms we're all rich people here. We're so blessed where we live and when we live. But you remember very well 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9. They that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare to many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil. So, again, you don't have to be rich to have a problem with money. And so I don't think Jesus is teaching these principles just to those who might be rich. It certainly applies to us all. Did you have another? Anybody? So in verse 13, first of all, verse 12, 11 and 12. So if you have not been faithful in unrighteous mammon, if you've not been faithful in regards to something as simple as money, who's going to commit to you true riches, which would be eternal things, right? And if you've not been faithful in that which belongs to another, who shall give you that which is your own? In other words, Jesus is just reiterating the principle of personal accountability. In everything that we have, whether it's our material prosperity and wealth or whatever other blessings that we have, there's a principle of accountability. And if you're not accountable for what you've been blessed with, how would you expect to get more? If you've not been blessed with what you have, who's going to entrust more to you? And I think it's back to this idea of everlasting habitations. In other words, there is an eternal consequence to how accountable and faithful we have been in using the blessings that we receive in this life. That's just a principle that is true, and I think Jesus is reiterating it there. Tom?
Just look at that too, is that they will receive you into eternal voice. Sometimes we focus on heaven, but he could have been talking about, their eternal dwelling is going to be hell. And then with what he says in verse 10, if you're faithful in a few things, be faithful in much. If you're unrighteous in a few things, you're unrighteous in much.
Okay.
So, if you took it the other way, okay, the friends are, their eternal dwelling is about where you really want to be. That's where you're going to spend. You're going to be invited there with them.
That would be true too. Okay, so he asked the question, what choice must every servant make in verse 13? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. He cannot serve God and mammon. Which is almost, if not, I didn't check to see if it's word for word identical, but it's obviously very similar to Jesus' statement in the Sermon on Mount, Matthew 6, what is that, verse 24, I think. 6:24. So I didn't check to see if it's verbatim, but if it's not, it's so close you can't hardly tell the difference. The principle is, who do you serve? In other words, this is not teaching. And we know that through the times of religious history, there have been some who have taken, there's certain Catholic orders, for instance, that take a vow of poverty. They disown themselves of every material thing. I don't believe that's what Jesus is teaching here at all. Else, the previous verses would say, if you have any money, get rid of it. It's going to keep you from going to heaven. He didn't say that. He said, use it. And so here, the issue is not, do you have wealth? The issue is, which one do you serve as top priority? That's the question. And that's the question that we all have to deal with. You cannot serve God and wealth. In other words, you can't have God and wealth at an equal spot up here at the top of your list. And sometimes Christians do that. Sometimes Christians put wealth above God even. And you can't do that. It's just not possible. But the problem is, Jesus is saying here, you got to decide what is your priority. Because if you try to make them both your priority, you'll end up loving one and hating the other, or vice versa. It just doesn't work. Jesus says it doesn't work. You got to choose. And so, I think that's a special challenge to us living in these prosperous times. We've got to choose. What is our top priority, Tom?
The master said he was going to get rid of it. He acknowledged he was pretty shrewd about doing what he did. He said, I'm not doing my job back.
He didn't get his job back for being shrewd, did he?
And that's sort of the same thing, the Lord entrusts us with something. He's given us a task to do. We can choose to do it, honoring and serving that way, or we can choose to do it for our own personal gain, and we might try to hide it from him, but he's going to know.
Oh, he knows. Yeah.
And that's what I said. Guy evidently trying to hide it from him, but the rumors got back to the master.
Yeah, you're going to, the scripture says, be sure your sin will find you out. You might think you could hide it. He might thought he could hide it from his master, and maybe he did for a while, but it's just not going to be forever. And, that's certainly a lesson that we need for sure. Be sure your sin will find you out. All right, real quick, we're just out of time. The last verse there, verse 14. The Pharisees also who were covetous heard all these things, and they derided him. Now, as we said at the start of our study, the previous parables were directed toward the Pharisees. This one in chapter 16, verse 1 is directed to his disciples, but the Pharisees are still hearing it. And when they heard this, and this verse may actually be a little broader. This verse may go back and include the teaching of the three parables in chapter 15, because chapter 15 ends without a stated reaction of the Pharisees. Jesus started addressing the Pharisees because they said, this man associates with sinners and publicans. So Jesus taught lost sheep, lost coin, prodigal son. In response to their criticism, he associates himself with sinners. Then and I think it is right to view this parable of the unjust steward likely right in conjunction with those other, but addressed to his disciples. This was addressed to his disciples. And at the end of that is the first time it mentions the Pharisees again. And verse 14, the Pharisees also who were covetous heard all these things, and they derided. In other words, they're not going to accept that. They're going to reject and belittle the teaching of Jesus. If that has to do just with this last parable, I could live with that. But I'm thinking maybe it pertains to all four parables in chapter 15 and this far in chapter 16. The reason here, especially the reason why they rejected the teaching of this last parable, would be because they were covetous. Because they very much had the problem, right, of serving the mammon of unrighteousness. That was a huge issue with them. And so what happens when people hear things that directly address something that they're involved in, directly addresses a personal weakness or flaw in their lives? Well, you got two choices, right? You can accept it and change, or you can say, I don't like that. I don't go for that. I don't even like that preacher. He's awful. So you can accept it and change, or you can do as the Pharisees did here. You can deride the teaching and the teacher if you want to. It doesn't change the truth. They were covetous, they had that problem, and they weren't ready to change from it. All right, any final thoughts? Mike?
I was going to say, if you're putting money or anything before God, that's you're making that an idol.
Yeah.
And then if you trust your wealth, you're trusting in an idol that can't save you.
It's not going to save you.
So
That's right. That's right. Exactly right. All right, thanks everybody. Good comments.